Hey everyone, it's Michael. Today I'm here to present an interview I recently conducted with author Jeff Guinn, who you may know from his prior true crime adjacent books, Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson, as well as The Road to Jonestown, Jim Jones, and People's Temple. In this episode, we're going to chat a little bit about Jeff's new book, Waco, David Koresh, The Branch Davidians, and A Legacy of Rage. Jeff and I get into the specifics about the book throughout the interview. And as someone who did not know a ton about the finer workings of the Waco story beforehand, I can promise that it is excellent. I would highly encourage each of you try and find a copy at your local bookstore or library. So before we get started, I just wanted to congratulate you on such a great book. I actually just finished it last night. I just got it this past week and I'd sped my way through it. It is such a great book. Yeah, I've never really done a deep dive into, the Branch Davidian or the Waco story beforehand. Pretty much everything I've seen has been from, pop culture, and
Sure.
I'm sure you're familiar with the miniseries that came out a couple of years ago. Yeah, so my knowledge of it was pretty much limited to that, and I just wanted to really commend you on how you managed to chart the evolution of that compound. How it started with, the original followers that went to Waco in the early 20th century.
Thank you. That was something I really thought was important. How can we understand what the Branch Davidians did in 1993 if we didn't know how they'd evolved?
Yeah, definitely. It was something that I think just brought a lot more context to what happened. And, I was particularly drawn to the story of the Rodin family, which, is one that I had never really heard of before, but I feel like that could almost be an entire, a mini series of its own. Would you mind going into how you started researching that?
We can't understand what David Koresh did and what the Branch Davidians did under Koresh's leadership unless we also understand Ben Rodin, Lois Rodin, George Rodin, the family that basically preceded Koresh leading the Branch Davidians. In each case, starting with Ben Rodin, the concept was that the leader of the Branch Davidians had to be a prophet living among us today who'd gotten a message from God, what the Branch Davidians called a new light, that would tell them things that God wanted them to do to become more holy and more worthy. Ben Rodin took control of the Branch Davidians in Waco in the early 1960s. And he said he had a message from God that the end of days was coming, and it was the role of the Branch Davidians to prepare the way for those who would be saved. And so, under Ben Rodin, the Branch Davidians started keeping the Jewish calendar and ceremonies, and even established communities in Israel because the end times were going to come there. Lois Rodin succeeded her husband. When he died, her message from God was that the Holy Ghost was female as well as male. She said she had a vision of an angel that was both genders, found biblical scripture to enforce it. Lois became the patron of young Vernon Wayne Howe, who'd become David Koresh. But Lois and Ben's oldest son, George, thought he ought to actually inherit the leadership of the Branch Davidians, and it ended up with him and Vernon Howe and some of Vernon's supporters shooting it out, an actual gunfight at Mount Carmel. Think the gunfight at the OK Corral, only in modern times. Vernon Howe and his followers went on trial for attempted murder, were acquitted. George Rodin went insane legally and ultimately was packed off to an asylum. The whole story of the Rodin family shows how the Branch Davidians were always ready to accept a new prophet who would tell them something that outsiders might think was even more extreme. And that's why David Koresh became the leader, because he ultimately came up with the ultimate prophecy that, if it came true, would bring about the end times and make the Branch Davidians the leader of God's new 1,000-year kingdom that would come afterward.
Yeah, it's really impressive just the way that you detailed that story in particular. Sorry, I'm just going to compliment you again for a minute. But
thank you.
Yeah, one of the things that I really liked about this book is that you do a really good job of highlighting what I've almost been describing to I've been relaying, parts of the story to my wife as I've been reading. And I've been calling these like the small tragedies that are almost kind of like overlooked in the grand scale of Waco. And George Roden, like he seemed like a person that I would not have liked, but it's like in retrospect, you can't help but almost feel bad for him. Like I feel like this story is almost like a story of I don't know, people that came from broken homes and they kind of found each other. And I feel like he's definitely one of those.
People who want to find a leader who is going to raise them above everybody else and protect them and always know the right thing to say or do. These are generally the ones that fall into what is commonly and incorrectly called a cult. A cult supposedly is some obviously deranged demagogue leading it and a bunch of sheep-like, basically dumb people following along. And in this story, in the story of Waco and Mount Carmel, is the case with almost every other story of this nature. There's so much more going on, not just the people who do the leading, but the people who choose to follow. There is a lot of intelligence and capability in the Branch Davidians who believed things that they were told by Ben Lois, George Roden, and Vernon Wayne Howe, who became David Koresh. Each of these stories needs to be at least basically understood if we're going to have any understanding, any context of the things that happened at Mount Carmel in 1993. We're not trying to say just what happened in this book. Everybody already knows what happened. What we're trying to demonstrate is why things happened and how things happened, that history doesn't occur in a vacuum. And the fact that Waco in 1993 basically is the genesis of a lot of anti-government paranoia, violence, death afterward in America. It's still deeply affecting us today.
Yeah, I really appreciated kind of the end chapters of the book, namely the chapter that you called "A Legacy of Rage," because you do a great job of like pinpointing how. I mean, I guess it's been kind of apparent, especially over the past handful of years, but how Waco has had such like a profound effect on America, and even if David Koresh did not intend on, I mean, he did, but
Yeah.
he didn't. If he didn't intend to become a martyr in this way, he really has, because Waco led to the galvanization of those extremist groups, and Waco seemed to cement their worst fears about the government, kind of turning them into the Babylon that David predicted them to be.
The thing about David Koresh is that for anyone who sets himself up as a prophet, this is true of Charles Manson, it's true of Jim Jones, but David Koresh and his Branch Davidian followers were different than the so-called criminal cults that America had been used to. Manson was just a former pimp, and the only people he could control were a couple dozen drug-addled teenagers. Jim Jones led what was called a church, but it wasn't really that. It was much more of a social movement. They were trying to bring about social change. But David Koresh and his followers were absolutely convinced. Now, they weren't pretending, not David, not the people who followed him, that David was channeling straight from God things that God wanted them to do. And as one of the survivors of Mount Carmel said to me, if you believe in God, and if you believe that God is telling David what you should do, wouldn't you do it? And what they were prepared to do was fight the agents of Babylon, in this case, beginning with the ATF. They were ready to kill for God as well as live for God. And then they all not only expected, but longed to be killed in their turn because they believed their souls would be translated up to heaven. And David, as the Lamb of Revelation, would then lead them back, defeat Babylon, and prepare the way for Jesus to return. Outsiders, might roll their eyes and go, my God, who would believe this? But they were intelligent people from all different walks of life. And David was telling them the Bible and God said to do things. The sincerity can't be doubted. And that's what makes it hard to say anybody's really the villain here. I mean, you've got two government agencies and a church, a religious faith Each was just doing what it believed was the absolute right and only thing to do, and tragedy resulted.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a major part of what's made the Waco story, so compelling over the years is that, on the one hand, like people that don't have a religious faith can look at it and say like, oh, these people were crazy. But like you said, like there's a sincerity in that that's almost, I don't know, respectable. I'm trying to think of like the right word for it, but it's like I think everyone in life kind of craves something that they feel that passionately about. And so that's why it definitely makes them, not villains per se, but you know, I'm trying to figure out a way to phrase it, but it's like
Oh,
you
no,
almost a way to root for them, if that makes sense.
there is no way really to phrase it simply beyond the fact that the two government agencies, ATF and FBI, they had leaders who made some awful, wrong-headed decisions. And neither of those agencies ever bothered, and this is documented in the book. The people who were planning the original raid on Mount Carmel and the siege, none of them actually knew or cared what the Branch Davidians believed. They had no idea of the sincerity of these people saying, we are ready to fight and die. That they weren't only ready to do it, they were eager to. This was their reward from God. The Branch Davidians, on the other hand, believed only in what they said David had revealed to them through God. They didn't care that they were breaking laws. It didn't matter to them that in order to achieve their own aims, they had to kill other people. To them, anything secular, anything outside what they called the message, was evil, Satan inspired, and wrong. When you get complete ignorance and intolerance on both sides of people who are facing each other, have guns, tanks, lethal gas, and are ready to use these things, there is an inevitability about this. And again, who do you root for? You don't necessarily root for anybody, but you want to understand what motivated each side. So, for God's sake, let's see if we can't figure this out so it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, definitely. So you kind of touched upon how the ATF and the FBI were both kind of collaborating throughout the siege, and one of
Mhm.
the things in the book that you really do a good job playing out is the kind of the build up to the raid and how the ATF had been under like a lot of political and kind of inside pressure to
Mhm.
get things right, and how that led to a lot of like miscalculations and probably like you said they didn't even really know about the religious beliefs of those at Mount Carmel until what was it, the Sinful Messiah newspaper series came out like a day or two beforehand.
And even the Sinful Messiah newspaper series missed a lot.
Mhm.
The agents themselves. Now, one of the things in the book that I think is helpful is of the agents, the 76 of them who took part in the initial raid on February 28th, 1993, had never talked on the record about the things that had happened, what they had been told by their leaders, how they felt when the raid collapsed and the bloodshed and gunfire that it did, and afterward. So, for the first time, we see how ATF is getting its idea of who these people are inside Mount Carmel and what's going to happen when they go in after them with those illegal guns that are being held there. We didn't know that before. The fact that the ATF agents are coming in with bite-sized candies in their pockets instead of
Mhm.
bullets because they want to take care of the Branch Davidian kids and make sure they're not scared. They're going to give the kids Happy Meals. You get that whole side of it. And then, of course, with the FBI, who are notoriously closed mouths, one of the agents, the man who was the actual scribe for the whole siege, who had to be there for everything, very bravely has come forward and on the record talked about everything that happened too. None of this is conjecture. We've got it all down finally.
Yeah, it's I'm like I said, I'm trying to figure out a way to phrase this because like you want to believe that your government is always doing the right thing, and in situations like this, like obviously no one is rooting for David Koresh because the things that he did and he was doing at Mount Carmel, but yeah, just kind of the botched calculations by the government and how to approach it. Because in your book, you also detail how the ATF had embedded kind of undercover operatives nearby, and how for long periods they were supposed to be surveilling the property and they just weren't.
Well, see,
It's
that's
just,
the whole thing. I mean, what happened at Waco has fueled ever since the imaginations of conspiracy theorists that when something like this happens, it must have happened because it was a government plot to oppress citizens. And they leave out the fact that you've got fallible human beings who may make bad decisions, who may make misjudgments. And the ATF and the FBI afterward, in each case, there were attempted cover ups of certain things. The cover ups weren't trying to hide some great plot, that an intricate plot that had been worked out for decades to kill religious, innocent American citizens. They were cover ups because it's human nature if you screw up to either try to make yourself look good somehow or even invent something that isn't true, and they got caught. And when our government agencies are caught lying about one thing, then that can make the paranoid among us or the people who want to benefit from paranoia say, well, if they lied about that, they must have lied about everything else. And when it's really human fallibility and human nature. And that's one of the frustrating things here. Nobody meant for this to happen except for, and to me, this is important. We have three groups involved, basically ATF, FBI, and the Branch Davidians. Only the Branch Davidian agenda required that people had to die. There was nothing positive in it for ATF or FBI if any deaths ensued. So when you talk about perceiving the Branch Davidians as innocent victims of bloodthirsty government agents, you got to turn it around. It was only the Branch Davidians who had decided, who were determined that people were going to get killed.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and kind of like we were discussing a moment ago, like the ATF, there'd been a lot of like political pressure, and then in the book you detail how the World Trade Center bombing had taken place 2 days before, the raid was supposed to begin, and so that kind of led to a lot of people looking the other way at the time when this was the biggest operation in ATF history. So that kind of plays into the whole human fallibility
Much of
conversation.
history, and a lot of the tragedy in history uh, has as much to do with unfortunately terrible timing as anything else. ATF went into this raid while it was still part of the Treasury Department. And the Treasury Department and its agencies were distracted a couple days before the raid by a bombing of the World Trade Center. The FBI during the siege was trying to function, and the FBI is a division of the Department of Justice. They answer directly to the Attorney General of the United States, and America had no Attorney General. The Clinton administration was just coming into office in January, February, March, April 1993, and Reno still hadn't been confirmed. So neither the ATF or the FBI had one ultimate top of the totem pole to go to and say, should we do this or should we not do this? And again, that means you've got mid-echelon people scrambling, taking more responsibility than they should. Terrible timing. No attempt to understand what the other side is doing or thinking or believing. Of course, there was tragedy at the end. What else could have happened?
Yeah, it's really sad, really unfortunate. Kind of taking a step back for a second, one of the things I wanted to talk about was, another part of the story that I'd never really heard about before was some of the former Branch Davidians. They had become, disillusioned with David Koresh and his teachings and had left. And I hope I get the name pronunciation right, but Mark Brault, who,
Mark Pro.
yeah, he seemed to be kind of an interesting part of the story that, in the main pop culture retelling of Waco doesn't really seem to get a lot of, attention. But it seemed like he had been trying behind the scenes to kind of like gather support for, people to look at Mount Carmel and what had been going on there. And that led to kind of like another part of the story that I think gets overlooked is all the different investigations from different agencies that
Right.
had been focusing on one small part of what was going on there, but there wasn't really a cohesive investigative effort until, 1992, thereabouts.
Well, one of the things I think we forget in terms of David Koresh and the Branch Davidians who were at Mount Carmel is that it wasn't just always the same people coming and staying forever. It wasn't static. As Koresh revealed his various prophecies, coming back with this new light and that new light, some of the things he said that God had ordained weren't acceptable to people who'd been following him up to that point. Almost all the Branch Davidians were former members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church teaches, imbues in its members that there are prophets on earth and the end time is coming soon, and only the people who really understand what God wants will be spared to go into the next kingdom. So they have that working for them at Mount Carmel. But then David Koresh announces that he personally is the Lamb of the book of Revelation. And that means that the Branch Davidians no longer just have a mission of trying to reach other people and teach them the right ways to live the way God wants, but that they have to actually initiate the end of days, which in Revelation, of course, comes with a big battle between the true believers and Babylon. So some of them left. They didn't like that. Then David starts saying that God wants him to take wives because Revelation says the Lamb shall spread his seed. So he needed to do some seed spreading. There are 24 elders mentioned in Revelation that help rule the earth after the end times. And Koresh said that these were going to be his children. If he's going to have 24 children, then obviously he's going to need quite a few wives. His next new light was that every woman at Mount Carmel or among the Branch Davidians must be his wife, even if they'd been married to others. All the men would have to absolutely abstain from sex in every manner and form, but all the women had to start having sex with David. That drove away more of his followers, including Mark Broll, who had been maybe the right-hand man of David Koresh. And Broll, who just married another Branch Davidian woman and was not willing to share her, was so furious by this, he ultimately decided that David Koresh must be a false prophet. And so he began actively trying to warn authorities that, hey, there's a guy who's doing all these horrible things, bigamy, he's having sex with underage girls, he's got illegal weapons, something's got to be done. And he, along with some other disaffected former Branch Davidians, were the informers that helped ATF plan its initial raid. The problem was, by the time of the raid, the people who were informing on Koresh had been gone from Mount Carmel for over a year, and a lot had changed inside there, including the easy accessibility of all the members to automatic weapons that they could use at a moment's notice. Mm-hmm. So any leader in a religious or even political movement at some point is always going to be challenged by disillusioned former followers. It's inevitable. And in this case, because there were guns and the end of days part of the story, it was a volatile situation. Again, what happened, considering everything we can learn and we now know about the buildup, it just seems inevitable.
I know that you've written a previous book about Jonestown, and it seems like all of these, the religious leaders that tie, kind of the end of days or like some big prophecy into their teachings. Like, it seems like it always leads to this same path. And it's one of the things in the book that you really address is that, it seems to be like a recurring theme. And there's, kind of like you're just talking about, there's people that get disillusioned, and that leads to a lot of infighting.
Well, when I started this is my 25th book, by the way. Waco is that. I've written 3 books now that people tend to link together. One about Charles Manson, one about Jim Jones and People's Temple, and now David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. I'm not attracted to tragedy, but I have become immersed in the study of what will make otherwise rational people follow a demagogue in irrational ways. And there are similarities between Manson and Jones and Koresh. And if we study these, they show us the red flags, the warning signs, because any religious leader, even the minister at your neighborhood church, any politician running even for city council in some small town. There's a degree of demagoguery involved. You need to vote for me, or you need to do what I tell you to do, because if you don't, it's wrong. It could have terrible consequences. And every once in a while, you get someone like Manson or Jim Jones or David Koresh, and we won't mention any specific politicians, but we're aware of them. They all make the same claim that's the red flag. I am the only one who really knows what's happening and the only one who can save you from what terrible things are going to occur if you don't follow me and do exactly as I want you to. Right there, Manson, Jim Jones, David Koresh, other politicians, that's the red flag. And almost immediately after that, they will try to cut their followers off from the outside world, outside opinions. They don't want them to hear anybody saying, hey, wait a minute, that could be wrong. Have you thought about this? So they try to shut down the media. They try to shut down their followers, being able to talk to family and friends, discuss certain issues. Koresh told his followers, you can't even discuss what we're talking about with your families. Because say if you go home for the weekend and tell your mom and dad, David told us this or that, and they don't believe it, that anyone who heard David Koresh's message in any form and did not immediately believe it and align themselves with them was doomed. That when the end of days came, and it was about to come because David was going to bring it on, your mom and dad, your best friend, your sister, your brother, if you'd told them anything about what David believed and preached, and they didn't immediately drop everything and come join him, then they were among the doomed. There are always these signs, and it scares the hell out of me the more I study this, because you see it repeated. We've got to learn to recognize these signs so we can protect ourselves better from demagogues who are going to lead us into nothing but god-awful disaster.
Yeah, another point in your book that you bring up that I'd never known about before was that David Koresh, the ministry there, they used to distribute the audio tapes of,
Mm-hmm.
like the sermons, and then he cut that off because he didn't want, prior recordings to butt up with what he was currently preaching about. That was like an interesting note that I never knew about, and that kind of feeds into that whole, like, he didn't want to be questioned.
Well, two things about prophets. First of all, they've got to set themselves up in a way, if they need to change anything they've been saying before, that they can get away with it. I mean, Charlie Manson used to tell his followers, if you think something I'm saying contradicts what I told you before, it's because you're too stupid to know. David Koresh kept changing his prophecies about the end times. Initially, he said he and his followers were going to have to go fight Babylon in Israel, that this is where it was going to happen. Then suddenly God told him something new. Wait a minute, now it's probably going to happen right here in Waco. He didn't start out by claiming he needed numerous wives. He didn't then take the next step immediately of saying, every woman here is my wife and nobody else's. They have to have some flexibility there. In Koresh's case, he didn't want tapes of his sermons with his prophecies being sold to raise money for the Branch Davidians, because somebody who bought a tape that he'd made 6 months ago might next hear him saying something that completely contradicted it. He didn't want that, so no more selling tapes. But also a prophet, every damn prophet, whether it's religious or political, if you make the claim that you can foresee that this terrible moment is going to come, this awful thing is going to happen, it's undoubtedly going to happen, then at some point you have to deliver. Because if you can't, you'll be exposed as a false prophet. For David Koresh, he's been telling followers for a period of about 6 years, the end time is coming, and for the last couple of years that it's coming any minute and we're going to be part of it. Mount Carmel was a huge hovel. It was built right over anthills, so there's ants crawling everywhere. There's no heating or air conditioning, not much running water. I if you wanted to take a bath, you used a bucket. The living conditions were horrible. They were meant to be uncomfortable. A lot of different religious groups say that they have to live as plainly as possible because then they can worship better. But if you talk to the surviving Branch Davidians, and there are a few still living, people were getting sick of it. They wanted the end times to get going. Geez, we're uncomfortable physically every minute of every day. If ATF hadn't come in, if the Branch Davidians had been just left alone for a few more years, there's no telling what might have happened, because David's followers would have said, hey, wait a minute, you keep saying it's happening. Well, it needs to happen now. And if David Koresh had been allowed to draw up a blueprint for some government agencies to follow that would make his followers believe, you know what, David was telling the truth, it would have been exactly what ATF and then the FBI did during the initial raid and siege. What they did made those people in Mount Carmel decide David's been right and we're going to be holy martyrs and let's get on with it. So again, it's coincidence, it's terrible timing, it's inevitable.
Yeah, one of the things that, like, I was talking earlier about how you build up kind of the origins of the Branch Davidians and how that happened. And you kind of go into, William Miller with the formation of, the Seventh-day Adventist, how he had pretty much done the same thing. He had been predicting the end times, I think, quite a few times. And when it never happened, it just seemed like his following just kind of petered away. And then you kind of see that with Victor Hutef, I think the name is pronounced, who led his followers to Waco and kind of created the formations of Mount Carmel there.
Right. And again, I got shocked at some of the things that I found in my research. It takes about 3 years to do the research to be able to write a book like this. And that's 3 years, 24/7. I don't have a day job. This is what I do the whole time. But as I studied where David Koresh's prophecies came from, it turns out that David Koresh had plagiarized all his major prophecies almost word for word from somebody almost a century earlier, an American who called himself Koresh, the Lamb of Revelation, who was going to bring about the end times. That was a New York physician named Cyrus Teed, Teed, who tried to set up a group, Koreshians they called themselves, in Florida, because first Cyrus Teed, then David, or Vernon Wayne Howell, claimed that they had learned from God. They were the reincarnation of King Cyrus of the Old Testament. Cyrus in Hebrew is pronounced Koresh. Everything David Koresh prophesied, he took from somebody else. And that's now something we can document. He may not have known he was doing it. And again, in the book, we talk about how he might have been fed this information by Lois Roden rather than going out and finding it himself. But everything David Koresh was promising his followers wasn't anything original, unless God told one Koresh something and then a century later decided to do the same thing. Neither Cyrus Teed nor David Koresh ever did lead the end of days as we see now. But all these origins, how can we understand what happened at Mount Carmel in 1993 unless we're willing to kind of dig in and see how everything came to that moment? And again, that's my job as the writer of the book, to do all the homework and hopefully put it down coherently for anyone who cares to read about it.
Well, I just really want to applaud you again because, this book, I had a really hard time putting it down, and you do a great job. I think you spend well over half the book kind of leading up to the raid and the siege itself, which is, most people try and jump straight into the action-heavy parts of Waco, but I really like that you laid the groundwork and kind of these real-life people that often get portrayed as characters in a saga. Like, you actually did a good job of humanizing them and making them seem more than, what the Waco miniseries portrayed them as.
Well, one thing that is almost unique in my research for any of my books with this book, usually when I research, and again, I always try to start from scratch. I don't try to just write books that reinforce opinions I already had. I will meet people that I actively have respect for, and then I'll probably meet some that I don't care too much for, that I think maybe they were the ones that stirred the pot in the wrong way and made things happen. But for this book, talking to the agents of ATF who've been so vilified since, talking to the couple people from the FBI who would talk to me, talking to the Branch Davidians who've survived to this day, I came away impressed with the sincerity of each person. I never found anybody who'd gone into this in a malicious sense or had intentions of ruining somebody else. And almost everybody who talked to me, everything they told me checked out. Nobody was fibbing. People saw who had experienced the same things, had different memories of it. There are no heroes or villains in this story, but neither are there saints and martyrs. These are ordinary folks just like you and me, and the decisions all of us make are going to have some kind of result. In this case, tragedy. But if you're looking for people to hate, if you're looking for people to help fuel a paranoid vision of American government or the Christian religion, there's nobody like that here. There's just flawed human beings like all of us are.
Mhm. Yeah, so one part of the story that really affected me in a way that I didn't expect was when you briefly tell the story of Nathaniel Medrano, who was one
Right.
of the undercover operatives. And there were a lot of failures with the ATF and how they were surveilling the compound and, embedding their undercover operatives. And he was, a seemingly minor part of that operation. He just posed as a delivery driver and then, wasn't able to get inside, but he was he took it personally and thought that he was being blamed for the ATF's failure. So I think that was like a good part that you highlighted that normally gets drowned out by the rest of the Waco story.
Well, that's a very tragic incident. Medrano, by all accounts, was a good guy, a talented young agent, ambitious to do more. And like all the other ATF agents I talked to, he took a certain pride in his job. He had sworn an oath to protect citizens of the United States, and he was doing his best to do it. He was asked by one of his supervisors if he would work undercover, pretend to be a UPS agent, and drop off a package at Mount Carmel and ask, by the way, can I use your bathroom? Because then he could get inside and get a look at how that was set up before the raid. Well, they didn't let him in. They gave him a roll of toilet paper and pointed to the outhouse behind the building. There wasn't working indoor plumbing at Mount Carmel. But they also saw that Medrano had grown his hair long. He'd been doing undercover work in a gang before this. And he has hair tied back in a ponytail. Before Medrano went out to pretend to be a UPS driver, delivery guy, he asked his supervisor, should I cut my hair? Because, these guys, these delivery guys, they all have short hair. And the supervisor said, oh no, I think the sense was these people at Mount Carmel, if they're stupid enough to follow David Koresh, they're not going to be bright enough to notice your hair. But the Branch Davidians instantly noticed the long hair, the ponytail, knew that this had to be an undercover government agent, and called the Waco McLennan County Sheriff's Office to complain about this shoddy undercover guy. Well, when Waco was over, and that was the only part Medrano played in it, he wasn't part of the actual ATF raid at the end of February. The government, the Treasury Department, published what they called the Blue Book, trying to show what went wrong, who made what mistakes. And in that Blue Book, there are just 2 paragraphs that say, maybe the most, I'm paraphrasing here, but maybe the most foolish thing that ATF did was send an agent posing as a delivery guy who had a ponytail. This is just indicative of the terrible planning that went into it. Medrano saw that and was horrified. He thought that meant he was being singled out above all others as the cause of everything going wrong. And so he begged his supervisor, can we please get them to rewrite this? I didn't do something that was as bad as it seems. And they kept saying, this isn't anything. Don't worry about it. It doesn't even have your name in here. But it worked on him and it ate at him. And one day he put his gun in his mouth and he killed himself right in an ATF office in Los Angeles. Every tragedy has further consequences. It just doesn't end when the day's over and the initial body count is totaled up. Medrano was one of the victims, but when you think about it, Everybody involved, ATF, FBI, Branch Davidians, those who survived this have been victims ever since. 30 years of public judgment by people who want to condemn one side or the other without knowing all the facts. It's burned into them. They all feel it to this day.
Yeah. It's a real tragedy. And, one thing I kind of want to ask you about, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but
Sure.
we were talking a little bit ago about how, you focused these three books, the Koresh book, the Manson book, and the Jim Jones book, kind of the stories about how people get led here. And I just wanted to ask your opinion, like, if there was someone who was stuck in a situation like this, like following a religious leader and they didn't really know a way
Right.
out, is there any advice you would offer them or to their loved ones?
To those who are asked to come and join a group, be it religious, political, whatever, do not give up control of your money. You need to have funds. So if you decide you don't want to be there, you can call a cab or maybe rent a car that you can get away. The second thing is, anytime you're told by someone you're following, the first time you hear, now we don't want you to tell your friends about this or your family about this or whatever, that's a warning sign. A former follower of Jim Jones, who survived Jonestown, said to me, you have to think of it as sort of a pot of water on a stove. If you're a frog who's dropped in a pot of water that's already boiling, you'll hop out. But the problem is, if you're the frog, you hop into a pot of simply lukewarm water and the heat just turns up gradually. At some point, you just find yourself being boiled to death and you can't help yourself. Anytime somebody wants control of your money, your outside communication, or what you're allowed to believe, all in all, leave now. If somebody's absolutely stuck in the middle of it and can't get out, families, notify the authorities, do something, because it will not end well if things are just left as they are.
Yeah, thank you for answering. I know that's kind of a big, almost uncomfortable question, but I've covered stories about religious followings before, and people oftentimes will send me suggestions about, my sister started following this religious guru or something, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't know what to do for her. It's really good to get your advice. Thank you.
Sure.
So before we wrap up this interview, I just wanted to ask, you've kind of talked about the lasting legacy of Waco and
Right.
how it's kind of affected, like the extremist groups and people are always looking for some meaning in whatever happened. Is there anything else you would like to talk about or anything else you would like to clarify about your book?
I really hope people will carefully read the last chapter because there is a direct line between Waco and some horrible things that have happened since. From the Oklahoma City bombing of the federal building 2 years later to the January 6, 2021 insurrection in Washington. A lot of the same people have been involved. We always look for reasons why there's some conspiracy against us, something keeping us from being who we are. And the government gets blamed a lot and the government screws up a lot. That's true. But having written these books that I've written and really tried to study everything involved, never automatically assume conspiracy as opposed to human fallibility. And most of all, violence is never going to correct anything you think is wrong. People have used Waco as an excuse to do things, not as, let's say, a legitimate reason. Think very carefully who's telling you about all these conspiracies and whether they're benefiting from you believing it and sending the money and doing various things. If we understand Waco, what really happened there, and then have some sense of how it's affected America ever since, and it still does to this day, that's maybe when we can start stopping some of the madness that continues consuming us. This is an important story. I hope people read the book and think about things.
Thanks for listening, everybody. I thought the chat with Jeff went great, due in no small part to him being a very thoughtful and insightful person. I hope you can forgive my nervousness throughout. My daughter had started going through a pretty profound sleep regression that week, and I was also pretty nervous to be interviewing someone that I greatly admire. Jeff was really wonderful though, and I can't thank him enough for being able to decipher what exactly I was saying between my you-knows and other verbal crutches. If you're interested in learning more about the Waco story, I would highly encourage you to pick up Jeff's book, Waco, David Koresh, The Branch Davidians, and A Legacy of Rage. It's honestly a really great book, and spends more time focusing on how things happened and the build-up to the ATF raid, rather than what happened, which I genuinely enjoyed. It's great, so like I said, try and find a copy wherever you can. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the Waco story, make sure to tune in again next week, when I will begin a 5-episode series on the Branch Davidians at Mount Carmel. Until then, I hope you all stay safe, and I'll talk to you later.